The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Marcus Rivera cut the lock on storage unit 247, his calloused hands shaking from more than just the December cold. $50, his last $50, gambled on whatever lay behind this metal door in a Denver storage facility. The unit was packed with antiques, but one piece dominated the shadows, a complete suit of medieval armor standing like a silent sentinel. As Marcus approached, something glinted from within the helmet's eye slits. Not metal, not a reflection, something wet. Marcus had seen death before. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him the smell of blood, the weight of secrets, the way darkness could live inside a man's chest. But when he lifted the visor, what stared back wasn't human, and it was very much alive. The thing whispered his name, his real name, the one he'd buried with his military records, the one connected to an incident his unit swore never happened in those caves outside Kandahar. How could this medieval relic know about the ancient symbols they'd found carved into those cave walls? Marcus stumbled backward, his worn boots catching on a dusty Persian rug. The visor clanged shut with a metallic finality that echoed through the storage facility's corridor. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pressed himself against the opposite wall, staring at the armor that had somehow spoken his classified name. The name that existed only in redacted files buried so deep, the Pentagon pretended they'd never been written. Staff Sergeant Michael Randolph had died in those caves 6 years ago. Marcus Rivera was just a homeless veteran with PTSD and a drinking problem, at least according to his VA records. The transformation had been necessary. What they'd witnessed in the Kandahar cave system couldn't follow them home. The army had made sure of that, relocating his entire unit, giving them new identities, new histories. Clean slates for dirty memories. But the armor knew. Marcus's breath came in sharp puffs in the unheated storage facility. He should run. Every instinct screamed at him to bolt, to pretend he'd never found this place, never spent his last 50 on a desperate gamble. But something held him frozen, the same morbid curiosity that had driven him deeper into those Afghan caves, when every rational thought had begged him to retreat. The storage unit was crammed with relics from another era. Victorian furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghosts among medieval tapestries. Ornate wooden chests lined the walls, their brass fittings green with age. Everything spoke of wealth and old European nobility, the kind of collection that should have been in a museum, not rotting in a Denver storage locker. Marcus forced himself to move, keeping his distance from the armor as he examined the other pieces. Maybe he'd imagined it. PTSD could do that, blur the lines between reality and nightmare. His therapist at the VA had warned him about episodes, flashbacks that could make the past bleed into the present until he couldn't tell which was which. A wooden placard near the armor's feet caught his attention. The brass nameplate was tarnished but readable. Sir Godfrey de Montfort, 9th Crusade, acquired Kandahar province, 1271. The blood in Marcus's veins turned to ice water. Kandahar, the same region where his unit had been conducting operations, the same caves where they'd found things. Things that predated Islam, Christianity, any religion that had names. Things that the army had declared classified beyond the highest clearance levels. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, muscle memory guiding him to dial a number he'd sworn never to use again. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This line is supposed to be dead." The voice was gravelly, aged by 6 years of carrying secrets. "Collins, it's me. We need to talk." A long pause. "Marcus? Jesus Christ, you know we can't." "I found something. In Denver. It's connected to Kandahar." The silence stretched until Marcus thought the line had gone dead. When Collins spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "What kind of connected?" "The kind that knows my real name." Another pause, longer this time. In the background, Marcus could hear children laughing, the domestic sounds of the life Collins had built with his new identity. "Burn it," Collins said finally. Whatever you found, burn it and walk away. Don't call this number again." The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, then at the armor standing sentinel in the shadows. The eye slits seemed to track his movement, though he knew it was impossible. Medieval steel didn't have eyes. It didn't whisper names or remember classified operations from centuries in the future. But as he turned to leave, something shifted inside the helmet, a wet, sliding sound like something organic moving against metal. The sound he'd heard echoing through those Kandahar caves just before his unit had stumbled onto discoveries that officially never existed. The armor spoke again, its voice like rust, scraping against bone. "You cannot run from what you are, Sir Marcus. You never could." The visor opened with a deliberate, mechanical precision, revealing not emptiness, but something that had been waiting for him to return home. The storage unit's metal door groaned as Marcus yanked it higher, rust flakes drifting down like ancient snow. The overhead fluorescent buzzed intermittently, casting erratic shadows that made him squint. $50. His last $50, blown on what looked like a hoarder's wet dream. Cardboard boxes towered in precarious stacks, their corners soft with age and moisture. A musty smell hit him. Old paper, forgotten fabric, and something else he couldn't quite place. Something metallic and cold. He stepped inside, the concrete floor gritty under his worn boots. The first few boxes yielded nothing promising. Christmas decorations from the 80s, their tinsel tarnished black. A collection of romance novels with cracked spines. Children's toys that someone had once loved, now destined for a landfill. Marcus's stomach growled, reminding him that his last meal had been yesterday's half-eaten sandwich from behind the diner. He was about to give up when he spotted something glinting in the back corner, partially hidden behind a rolled carpet. Metal caught the stuttering light, and for a moment his breath hitched. Not the familiar glint of modern steel, but something older, darker. Marcus pushed aside the carpet and froze. A complete suit of medieval armor stood propped against the far wall, as if its wearer had simply vanished, leaving behind only the shell. But this wasn't the polished museum piece he might have expected. The metal was black with age, covered in a patina that seemed to shift in the unreliable light. Intricate engravings covered every surface, symbols that hurt to look at directly, patterns that seemed to writhe when he wasn't focusing on them. The helmet was the worst part. Its visor was down, creating a dark void where a face should be. Two narrow eye slits gazed out at nothing, yet Marcus felt distinctly observed, judged. The armor's breastplate bore a coat of arms he didn't recognize, a twisted tree with roots that looked more like grasping fingers, set against a field of what might have been stars or might have been something else entirely. His hands shook as he reached toward it. This had to be worth something. Had to be. Medieval armor, even reproductions, sold for thousands. But as his fingers drew closer to the metal, that familiar dread crept up his spine. The same feeling he'd had in the mountains of Afghanistan, right before the mortars started falling. Right before he'd seen... No, those weren't memories. Dr. Martinez had been clear about that. PTSD manifested in many ways, and false memories were common among veterans. The mind created elaborate fantasies to cope with trauma. The things he remembered seeing in that cave, the creatures with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals, the sense of recognition that had flooded through him, none of it was real. But looking at this armor, those false memories felt more vivid than his own name. Marcus touched the gauntlet. The world exploded into sensation. Images flooded his mind. Not the grainy, fragmented memories of his tours, but crystal-clear visions that felt more real than the storage unit around him. He saw himself, but not himself. A man who wore his face but stood straighter, moved with deadly grace, wore this very armor as if it were a second skin. The man, he, was standing on a battlefield that reeked of sulfur and worse things. Bodies lay scattered around him, but they weren't human bodies. They were the same creatures from his nightmares, the ones Dr. Martinez insisted were trauma-induced hallucinations. multi-limbed monstrosities with flesh like molten rock, beings that defied every law of biology and physics. In the vision, his armored hands gripped a sword that blazed with its own internal light. He moved through the creatures like death itself, cutting them down with practiced efficiency. But he wasn't alone. Other figures in similar armor fought beside him, their movements coordinated with the precision of a unit that had fought together for lifetimes. Then he saw the cave. The same cave from Afghanistan, but not as it was now. Deeper, older, a gateway carved into living rock, covered in the same symbols that decorated this armor, and something vast and terrible stirring beyond that gateway, something that had waited in the dark between spaces for centuries, patient as stone. The vision shattered as Marcus jerked his hand back, gasping. He stumbled backward, knocking over a box of old photographs that scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. His heart hammered against his ribs, and for a moment he couldn't tell if he was in the storage unit or back in that Afghan cave, watching his unit disappear into darkness while impossible sounds echoed from the depths. The armor stood unchanged, silent and waiting. But now Marcus could feel it watching him with an attention that was distinctly alien, not malevolent exactly, but measuring, as if it were trying to determine whether he was worthy of whatever terrible purpose it served. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "Some doors should stay closed, soldier." Marcus looked around the empty storage unit, skin crawling. No one else was here. No one else could have his number. The armor's helmet tilted slightly, metal grinding against metal with a sound like distant laughter. The storage unit's fluorescent light flickered overhead as Marcus stepped closer to the armor, his combat boots crunching on scattered packing material. The metal seemed to absorb the harsh artificial light, creating shadows that moved independently of his position. He'd seen plenty of replica medieval gear at Renaissance fairs and military history exhibits, but this piece radiated an authenticity that made his skin crawl. The helmet sat atop the breastplate like a severed head, its visor slightly askew to reveal a darkness so complete it seemed solid. Marcus found himself reaching toward it before catching himself, his hand trembling just inches from the cold metal. The tremor wasn't from his usual PTSD symptoms. This was something else entirely, something that felt like recognition. "You know me," whispered a voice that might have been the wind through the facility's ventilation system. Marcus jerked his hand back, spinning around to check the unit's entrance. Empty. The hallway beyond stretched in both directions, illuminated by the same sickly fluorescent strips that cast everything in harsh relief. Other unit doors lined the corridor like tombstones, each hiding their own secrets behind rolling metal barriers. He turned back to the armor, and his breath caught. Had the helmet moved? The visor now faced him directly, though he could have sworn it had been angled toward the back wall moments before. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan, catalogued possible explanations: unstable surface, settling foundation, optical illusion caused by fatigue and stress. But the primitive part of his brain, the part that had screamed warnings in the mountains of Kandahar, knew better. Marcus forced himself to approach the armor methodically, the way he'd been trained to approach potential IEDs. Look for wires, unusual shapes, anything out of place. The breastplate bore intricate engravings that seemed to shift in the flickering light, scenes of battle that were both familiar and impossible. Knights on horseback faced creatures that defied classification, things with too many teeth and eyes in all the wrong places. One engraving in particular made him stumble backward. A figure in identical armor stood atop a mountain of corpses, a sword raised toward a blood-red sky. The face beneath the raised visor was his own. "No," Marcus whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible." But even as he denied it, fragments of dreams, or were they memories, began surfacing. The weight of mail beneath the breastplate, the leather straps chafing against his neck, the screams of horses and men mixing with sounds no earthly throat could produce. And through it all, the hunger. God, the terrible hunger that could only be satisfied by... Marcus doubled over, retching. Nothing came up but bile, He hadn't eaten since yesterday. The acidic taste reminded him of copper pennies, of blood on his tongue after a particularly vivid nightmare. But those had just been dreams, trauma responses to what he'd experienced in the war. His therapist at the VA had explained it all very clearly before the funding ran out. "Put me on," the voice came again, clearer now. "Remember what you truly are." This time Marcus was certain the sound came from the helmet itself. The darkness within the visor seemed to pulse with each word, and he could swear he saw movement in those depths. Not his reflection, but something else wearing his face. He stumbled toward the unit's entrance, desperate for air that didn't taste of rust and ancient violence. But his legs wouldn't carry him past the threshold. Each step felt like walking through molasses, and an invisible cord seemed tethered between his chest and the armor behind him. The other items in the unit began to make sense now. The books with their arcane symbols, the scrolls covered in languages that predated Latin, research materials, instructions, historical accounts of something that should have remained buried in the Dark Ages. Marcus found himself turning back toward the armor, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. His reflection caught in the polished metal showed a face he barely recognized, gaunt, hollow-eyed, but underneath the ravages of war and homelessness lay something older, something that had worn this same expression across centuries of battlefields. The memories came faster now, cascading through his consciousness like a dam bursting. Not just Afghanistan, but older conflicts. Civil War trenches where he'd fed on Confederate soldiers, Revolutionary War battlefields where he'd drunk deeply of British blood. Further back still to medieval tournaments where he'd worn this very armor and claimed lives in the name of chivalry while satisfying hungers that had nothing to do with honor. Each lifetime ended the same way, a voluntary forgetting, a choice to become human again until the next war called to him. But the forgetting was never complete, and the hunger never truly died. Marcus reached for the helmet with steady hands now, understanding finally why $50 had bought him an entire storage unit. The previous owner hadn't abandoned these possessions. They had died fighting the same battle Marcus had been losing for months. The choice to remember or the choice to starve. The medieval armor stood in the storage unit like a silent sentinel, its polished steel surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, though the helmet's visor was raised, revealing only empty darkness within. He circled the armor slowly, his combat boots crunching on debris scattered across the concrete floor. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every rivet, every joint appeared hand-forged with meticulous care. Engravings covered the breastplate in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. Something nagged at the edge of his consciousness. The armor felt familiar in a way that made his stomach clench with unease. He'd seen it before, but not in any museum or movie. The memory lurked just beyond reach, like trying to recall a half-forgotten dream. Marcus reached toward the gauntlet, then hesitated. His hand trembled slightly, whether from his usual withdrawal shakes or something deeper, he couldn't tell. The metal appeared to pulse with a faint warmth, though that was impossible. Steel couldn't generate its own heat. "Just armor," he muttered, forcing himself to touch the gauntlet's knuckles. Medieval reproduction. Probably worth a few thousand to the right collector. The moment his skin made contact, the world exploded into chaos. Images flooded his mind with violent intensity. Not images, memories, but they weren't his memories. They belonged to someone else, someone who had lived centuries ago, someone who had worn this armor. He stood on a battlefield strewn with corpses, the acrid smell of blood and smoke filling his nostrils. But these weren't modern casualties. These were men in chain mail and leather, their bodies torn apart by claws and fangs rather than bullets or shrapnel. In the distance, something massive and serpentine coiled through the ranks of fleeing soldiers, its scales gleaming black in the firelight. He knew that serpentine creature. He'd seen it in Afghanistan, coiling through the smoke of burning villages. He'd seen it in Iraq, lurking in the shadows between buildings. His unit had called his episodes combat stress reaction, but the therapists had been puzzled by the consistency of his hallucinations. Most PTSD visions were chaotic, fragmented. His were always the same, a massive black serpent with eyes like molten gold, hunting through fields of the dead. "Impossible," he whispered, but even as he said it, pieces began falling into place. The dreams that had plagued him since childhood, decades before he'd ever seen combat. The strange sense of recognition he felt in museums when looking at medieval weapons. The way certain ancient symbols made his skin crawl with inexplicable dread. He approached the armor again, more cautiously this time. Beside the breastplate, partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten cloth, lay a sword in a leather scabbard. The weapon's pommel bore the same shifting engravings as the armor, and when Marcus wrapped his fingers around the grip, another wave of memories crashed over him. This time, he was inside the armor, looking out through the visor's narrow slit. The serpent reared before him, its massive head weaving hypnotically as venom dripped from fangs the length of cavalry sabers. Other knights lay scattered around him, their armor rent like tin cans. He was the last one standing, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would die here. But he died here before, many times, in many different lives across many different centuries. Marcus stumbled backward, the sword falling from nerveless fingers. The memories weren't just from one lifetime. They were fragments of dozens, hundreds perhaps. Each time the serpent had emerged from whatever hellish realm it called home, and each time, somehow, he had been there to face it. The armor wasn't just medieval. It was far older than that, passed down through generations of warriors who all shared the same face, the same soul. His face, his soul. He understood now why he'd been drawn to this storage unit, why the number had seemed so familiar. This wasn't coincidence or fate, it was inevitability. The armor had been waiting for him, just as it had waited for all his previous incarnations. Outside the storage unit, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, blotting out the afternoon sun. The air grew thick and oppressive, carrying the distant sound of something massive moving through the darkness between worlds. Marcus could feel it stirring, drawn by the resonance between the armor and its destined wearer. The serpent was coming, just as it had come before. And just as before, Marcus would have to face it. But this time, for the first time in centuries of endless cycles, he would face it with the full knowledge of what he truly was. The last guardian of a dying world. The emergency room's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Marcus sat hunched in the plastic chair, his hands still trembling from whatever had happened in that storage unit. The nurse had cleaned and bandaged the cuts on his palms, but she couldn't do anything about the images that kept flashing through his mind, the weight of chainmail against his shoulders, the screams echoing across a battlefield that existed centuries before he was born. "Mr. Chen?" Dr. Ramirez appeared beside him, clipboard in hand. She was young, probably fresh out of residency, with kind eyes that reminded him of his sister. "How are you feeling?" Marcus looked up at her, wondering how to explain that he felt like he was losing his mind. "Better?" He lied. "The cuts aren't deep, but I'm concerned about your mental state. The paramedics said you were found unconscious, muttering in what sounded like Old English." She sat down beside him, her voice gentle. "Have you experienced anything like this before?" The honest answer was yes. In Afghanistan, during the long nights when the morphine wasn't enough to keep the pain at bay, he'd had dreams that felt more real than reality. Dreams of swords and shields, of faces painted blue with woad, of standing in a shield wall as something monstrous charged toward them. The doctors had called it PTSD, trauma manifesting in elaborate fantasies. He'd believed them. Now he wasn't so sure. "Just nightmares," he said finally, "from the war." Dr. Ramirez nodded sympathetically. "I'm going to prescribe something to help you sleep, and I want you to consider talking to someone. There's a VA counselor who—" "I'll think about it," Marcus interrupted, though they both knew he wouldn't. He'd tried therapy before, sitting in circles, talking about feelings, pretending that pills could fix what was broken inside him. It never worked because they were trying to treat the wrong war. After she left, Marcus stared at his reflection in the black window. His face looked older than his 38 years, carved hollow by too many nights sleeping rough and too many meals skipped. But behind his own features, he could almost see another face, younger, fierce, with intricate tattoos spiraling across the cheeks. A Celtic warrior who had stood against things that history had forgotten. He shook his head violently, trying to dispel the image. This was exactly the kind of thinking that led to padded rooms and straitjackets. He needed to focus on reality, on the fact that he was homeless, broke, and had just wasted his last $50 on what might be the final nail in his sanity's coffin. But as he sat there, fragments kept surfacing. Not just images now, but knowledge. He knew that the armor in the storage unit was Saxon, probably 9th century. He knew the weight of a sax blade in his hand, could feel muscle memory of combat techniques no modern soldier had ever learned. Most disturbing of all, he knew what they had been fighting. The thing in the darkness wasn't human. It never had been. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to center himself using the breathing techniques they taught him in the hospital after his leg got shredded by that IED outside Kandahar. But instead of calm, the meditation brought more memories that weren't his own. A creature that moved like smoke and shadow, with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. They had bound it once, locked it away with iron and ancient words, but the binding was weakening, and somehow, impossibly, it was connected to what had happened to his unit in Afghanistan. "Mr. Chen?" The nurse was back, holding a small paper bag. "Your prescription. Take one at bedtime and please try to get some rest in an actual bed tonight." Marcus nodded and took the bag, knowing he wouldn't take the pills. He needed his mind clear, no matter how much it hurt. Because deep in his gut, below the rational part of his brain that insisted this was all psychological trauma, something primal was screaming a warning. The thing they had faced in that cave outside Kandahar, the thing that had killed Rodriguez and Patel and left Marcus broken in body and spirit, it wasn't gone. It was just wearing a different face, hiding in a different shadow. And the dreams, the memories, whatever they weren't random neural misfiring. They were preparation. Marcus stood up slowly, testing his weight on his bad leg. The storage unit was still his, paid for through the end of the month. Inside that armor, there might be answers, or there might be madness. But after 3 years of barely surviving on the streets, wondering why he'd lived when better men had died, he finally had something resembling a purpose. He limped toward the exit, past the concerned looks of the medical staff, past the safety of fluorescent lights and rational explanations. Outside, the autumn night was crisp and full of shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Time to go back and face whatever was waiting in the dark. The weight of Marcus's revelations pressed down on Jake like a physical force as they sat in the cramped apartment above the pawn shop. The old man's words echoed in his mind. Bloodline chosen, ancient evil. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the coffee mug, the bitter liquid doing nothing to warm the ice that had settled in his veins. "You're telling me I'm some kind of, what, supernatural soldier?" Jake's voice cracked with disbelief and growing dread. Marcus leaned forward, his weathered face grave. "The Custodes Umbrae, shadow guardians. For over 1,000 years your bloodline has stood against things that would drive ordinary men mad." He paused, studying Jake's face. "Tell me about your nightmares, the ones from Afghanistan." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd never spoken about them to anyone. Not the VA psychiatrists, not his former squad mates, not even Sarah before she left him. "How do you know about—" "Because they weren't nightmares, were they? You saw something in those caves, something that wasn't Taliban." The memories crashed over Jake like a tide of black water. The cave system outside Kandahar, 3 years ago. Their unit had been tracking insurgents when they discovered the entrance, ancient symbols carved into the rock face, symbols that had made his skin crawl with inexplicable recognition. Inside, the tunnels had stretched deeper than any natural formation should have, and the darkness had felt alive. "We lost Rodriguez first," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. He was on point when something grabbed him from above. But there was nothing there, at least nothing the others could see. His hands clenched into fists. I saw it, though, black as midnight with too many joints in its arms and legs, eyes like burning coals. When it looked at me, I heard whispers, in a language I shouldn't have understood, but somehow did. Marcus nodded grimly. The umbral spawn. They've been seeping through the cracks between worlds for millennia, drawn to places of violence and death. Battlefields are like beacons to them. The brass covered it up, Jake continued, lost in the memory. Said it was an IED, that Rodriguez was vaporized. But I know what I saw. The thing that killed him. It fed on his fear before it took him. He looked up at Marcus with haunted eyes. Why didn't it take me? Because you carry the blood of the Guardians. The armor responds to that bloodline, awakens the memories and abilities that have been passed down through generations. Your ancestor who wore it faced the same creatures you encountered in Afghanistan. Marcus stood and moved to an old trunk in the corner of the room. The nightmares you've been having since you returned, they're not trauma. They're remembering. Remembering what? Marcus lifted the trunk's lid and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Sir Aldrich de Montclair, 13th century, one of the first recorded guardians. He opened the journal carefully, revealing cramped medieval script alongside detailed drawings of creatures that made Jake's blood run cold. He wrote about the shadow things that feast on mortal terror, and the black armor blessed by ancient rites to stand against the endless dark. Jake stared at the illustrations, twisted forms with elongated limbs and burning eyes, exactly matching what he'd seen in the caves of Afghanistan. This is impossible. The world is far stranger and more dangerous than most people can comprehend, Marcus said quietly. The umbral spawn exists in the spaces between reality, feeding on human suffering and slowly weakening the barriers between dimensions. The Guardians have always stood against them, holding the line. A chill ran down Jake's spine as pieces began falling into place. The storage unit. How did you know I'd find it? Marcus's expression darkened. Because the armor calls to its bloodline when the need is great. And right now, Jake, the need has never been greater. He moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the street below. The spawn are growing bolder. Reports of unexplained disappearances are increasing across the country. Something is stirring in the deep places, something that has been patient and hungry for a very long time. Jake felt a familiar weight settle over him, the same sensation he'd experienced in the storage unit, as if invisible hands were placing armor across his shoulders. What am I supposed to do? I'm nobody, just a broken-down vet who can't hold a job. You're the last guardian, Jake, the only one left who can wear the armor and face what's coming. Marcus turned from the window, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of hidden knowledge. And you need to understand something else. Your encounter in Afghanistan wasn't random. They've been hunting you specifically, trying to eliminate the bloodline before it could awaken fully. The room seemed to grow colder as the implications sank in. Jake thought of the sleepless nights, the sense of being watched, the shadows that seemed to move just beyond his peripheral vision. They're still hunting you, Marcus continued. And now that you've claimed the armor, they know exactly where you are. The apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had crept inward while Marcus slept. He'd managed 3 hours of broken rest before the whispers started again, not the familiar voices of his fallen squadmates, but something else entirely, something that spoke in a language he shouldn't understand but did. He sat on the edge of his mattress, staring at the medieval gauntlets he'd brought back from the storage unit. In the pale morning light filtering through his cracked window, they looked almost ordinary. Almost. But Marcus could feel the pull, the same magnetic draw that had compelled him to touch the armor in that dusty concrete tomb. His phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Reeves missed our appointment yesterday. Everything okay? Everything was the opposite of okay. But Marcus couldn't exactly explain that he'd discovered he was somehow connected to a suit of armor that might be possessed by something ancient and malevolent. He typed back, "Sorry, emergency came up. Can we reschedule?" The response came quickly, of course. "How about this afternoon? 3 p.m. Marcus hesitated. Part of him wanted to tell Reeves everything, but another part, a growing part, whispered that the therapist wouldn't understand, couldn't understand. This was beyond PTSD, beyond anything in her textbooks. He agreed to the appointment and set his phone aside. The gauntlets seemed to gleam in response, metal warming despite the morning chill. When he'd brought them home last night, he told himself it was just to study them, to figure out what was happening to him. But deep down, he knew the truth. He couldn't leave them behind. They were part of him now. A knock at his door made him jump. Marcus quickly threw a towel over the gauntlets and checked the peephole. Mrs. Chen from the apartment management stood in the hallway, looking as tired as he felt. "Morning, Marcus. Got a minute?" He opened the door, keeping his body positioned to block her view of the covered gauntlets. "What's up?" "Had some complaints about noise last night. Sounds like you were moving furniture around." "Look, I know things have been tough, but the other tenants—" "I wasn't moving furniture." The words came out sharper than he intended. "I was asleep." Mrs. Chen's expression softened with concern. "Honey, Mr. Patterson downstairs said it sounded like you were dragging something heavy across the floor for hours. Around 2 in the morning. Marcus felt his stomach drop. At 2 in the morning he'd been dead asleep, hadn't he? The memories of the night felt strangely fragmented, like trying to recall a dream that kept slipping away. "I'll keep it down," he said quietly. After she left, Marcus pulled away the towel. The gauntlets lay exactly where he'd placed them, but something was different. His small apartment showed signs of disturbance. His few belongings shifted, scuff marks on the hardwood floor in strange patterns. It looked like someone had been pacing or practicing movements, sword movements. His hands shook as he reached for the gauntlets. The moment his fingers touched the metal, images flooded his mind. A battlefield under a blood-red sky, warriors in similar armor cutting down enemies with impossible skill, and through it all, a presence watching from within the armor, learning, waiting. The visions felt more real than memories, as if he'd lived them himself, as if some part of him had been there, fighting alongside knights who had died centuries before his birth. Marcus jerked his hands away, but the connection lingered. He could feel something stirring, something that had been sleeping but was now very much awake. The armor in the storage unit wasn't just haunted, it was inhabited, and by bringing these gauntlets home, he'd invited whatever lived inside to make itself comfortable. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger's face. His eyes held a coldness he'd never seen before, and for just a moment, he could have sworn his reflection smiled when he wasn't smiling. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. Marcus found himself researching medieval warfare tactics on his phone, absorbing information about sword techniques and battle formations with an eagerness that felt foreign. When he tried to stop reading, his hands moved on their own, scrolling to the next article, the next diagram. By the time he left for his appointment with Dr. Reeves, Marcus had filled 3 pages of notes in handwriting that wasn't quite his own. The letters were more angular, more precise, as if guided by someone accustomed to writing with a quill rather than a ballpoint pen. Walking to the therapist's office, he caught himself moving differently. His posture was straighter, his steps more measured, like a soldier, but not the kind trained in modern warfare. People on the sidewalk seemed to sense something off about him, giving him wider berths than usual. The worst part was how natural it felt, how right. The leather journal felt warm against Marcus's palms, its ancient binding pulsing with an energy that made his teeth ache. He'd been staring at the cramped Latin text for hours, but the words seemed to shift and writhe whenever he tried to focus on them. Only fragments came through clearly, like whispers cutting through static. Blood of the vessel, the sleeper stirs, when flesh remembers. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. The motel room's fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting intermittent shadows that made the armor in the corner appear to move. Marcus kept glancing at it, unable to shake the feeling that something behind the visor was watching him. A knock at the door made him jump. 3 sharp raps, too precise to be casual. Marcus slipped the journal under his pillow and approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair pulled back severely. She wore an expensive-looking black coat despite the heat. "Mr. Chen." Her voice was crisp, educated. "My name is Dr. Elizabeth Crane. I believe you have something that belongs to my organization." Marcus kept the chain latched. "Don't know what you're talking about." "The Blackwood storage unit. We've been monitoring it for quite some time." She held up a photograph, the same medieval armor now sitting in his room. "This artifact is extremely dangerous, more than you realize." His blood turned to ice. "How did you find you?" "The same way we've been tracking these objects for centuries." She stepped closer to the door. "Mr. Chen, you're experiencing the memories, aren't you? Seeing things that feel more real than your own life?" Marcus's hand trembled on the doorknob. Nobody could know about that. He'd never told anyone about the visions, the way they'd started bleeding into his waking hours. "The armor chooses its vessels carefully," Dr. Crane continued. "Always someone who's seen violence, death, someone whose mind is already familiar with darkness. It makes the transition easier." "Transition to what?" "Let me in, and I'll explain everything." Against his better judgment, Marcus unlatched the chain. Dr. Crane entered smoothly, her eyes immediately finding the armor. She studied it with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "Remarkable preservation," she murmured. "This particular suit dates to the 14th century, worn by Sir Edmund Blackthorne during the siege of Ashford Castle." She turned to Marcus. "Tell me, what have you seen in your dreams?" Marcus remained silent, but she seemed to read the answer in his expression. "Stone walls dripping with blood, the sound of screaming that goes on for hours, and always, always the hunger." Her voice was matter-of-fact. "The entity that inhabits this armor has been dormant for decades, but your proximity has awakened it. It's been feeding you memories, preparing you. You're insane." "Am I?" "Then explain the marks on your arms." Marcus looked down. Fresh scratches ran along his forearms, thin parallel lines that hadn't been there this morning. They looked like claw marks. "The previous host left those," Dr. Crane said. "Sir Edmund Blackthorne was a monster long before the entity chose him. It prefers vessels with a taste for violence. And you, Mr. Chen, killed 17 men in Afghanistan. That was war. Was it? Or did you enjoy it more than you should have?" Her eyes were pale, almost colorless. "The entity can sense these things. It's been calling to you for years, drawing you here." Marcus backed away from her, but she followed, unafraid. "My organization has been containing artifacts like this for over 400 years. We know how to help you." She reached into her coat and withdrew a small silver vial. "This will sever the connection before it becomes permanent, but you have to choose now. Once the bonding completes, there's no going back. And if I don't trust you, then in 72 hours, you'll put on that armor willingly. You'll walk out of this room as something else entirely, and people will start dying." She set the vial on the nightstand. "The last host killed 43 people before we stopped him. Men, women, children, it doesn't discriminate." The fluorescent light above flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. In the shadows, Marcus could swear he heard the whisper of metal against metal, like armor plates shifting. "It knows," Dr. Crane whispered. "It knows we're here." A sound came from the corner where the armor stood, a low, rhythmic breathing that definitely hadn't been there before. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds. Marcus grabbed the silver vial, but his hand hesitated halfway to his mouth, because part of him, a growing, hungry part, didn't want to break the connection. The entity's memories were intoxicating, full of power and purpose he'd never felt in his own life. In the darkness, something that sounded like laughter echoed from inside the medieval helmet. The basement beneath Miriam's Victorian house felt like descending into another century. Stone walls wept with moisture, and the air carried the scent of earth and something else, something that made the thing inside Marcus stir with recognition. Ancient candles flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and glass jars containing unidentifiable specimens. "Sit," Miriam commanded, gesturing to a heavy wooden chair carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Marcus remained standing, his hand instinctively moving to touch the hidden amulet beneath his shirt. The metal had grown warm against his skin. Miriam noticed the gesture and smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You feel it awakening, don't you? The memories bleeding through. Tell me, Marcus, what do you see in your dreams?" "I don't know what you're talking about." His voice came out rougher than intended. "Liar." She moved to one of the shelves and withdrew a book bound in what looked like human skin. The cover bore the same twisted symbol from the armor. "You've been having the dreams since you put on the gauntlets. Visions of another time, another war." Bodies piled high under a crimson sky. Marcus felt his knees weaken. She was describing exactly what he'd seen, down to the smallest detail. "How do you—" "Because I've been waiting for you." She opened the book, revealing pages covered in spidery text and grotesque illustrations. Or rather, waiting for him. The Crimson Night. My ancestor wrote about the binding ritual, about how they trapped the demon lord Vasago in that armor after the failed crusade of 1274. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Vasago. He knew that name, had screamed it in languages he'd never learned during his worst nightmares. The thing inside him pulsed with dark satisfaction. "The binding was meant to be permanent," Miriam continued, turning pages that seemed to move on their own. "But souls like his, they find ways to corrupt even the strongest chains. Over the centuries, the armor has been lost and found again. Each time, Vasago grows stronger, feeding on the trauma and violence of whoever wears it." "You're insane." But even as he said it, Marcus could feel the truth of her words settling into his bones like ice. "Am I? Tell me, Marcus, how do you explain your superhuman strength? The way you tore through those gang members like tissue paper? The voices whispering in the dark corners of your mind?" She was right, and they both knew it. The amulet around his neck burned hotter, and Marcus realized it wasn't protection. It was a leash. "What do you want from me?" "What my family has always wanted. To complete the binding." Miriam's eyes gleamed with fanatic fervor. "My bloodline has guarded this secret for 700 years. We are the custodians tasked with ensuring Vasago never fully breaks free. But the old bindings weaken with each vessel. Soon, he'll have enough strength to abandon your body and manifest in his true form. Then help me get rid of it." Marcus stepped forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "If you know how to stop this thing—" "Oh, I do." She smiled again, and this time he saw the madness dancing behind her eyes. "But not in the way you're hoping. The only way to strengthen the binding is with blood sacrifice, the willing death of the current vessel." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Marcus's breath came out in visible puffs as he backed toward the stairs. "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about salvation." Miriam's voice rose, echoing off the stone walls. 7 billion souls versus one broken soldier. The mathematics are quite simple. Something changed in the air around them. The candles flickered wildly, and Marcus felt the presence inside him surge forward with sudden hunger. His vision tinted red around the edges, and when he looked down, his hands were beginning to change. Skin darkening, fingers elongating into claws. "He can sense my intention," Miriam whispered, backing against the bookshelf. "He's fighting for control." Marcus gritted his teeth, trying to force the transformation to stop, but it was like trying to hold back a tide. The thing that called itself Vasago whispered seductively in his mind, promising power, promising revenge against all who had wronged him. "The knife!" Miriam gasped, pointing to an ornate dagger lying on a stone altar. "Silver blessed by 13 popes. While you're still in control." But Marcus was already moving, not toward the knife, but toward the stairs. Whatever fragment of his own will remained knew that staying here meant death, either his own or everyone else's. The custodian's screams followed him as he burst through the basement door, her words echoing in his mind. "You can't run from what lives inside you. He'll never let you go." Outside, Marcus ran through empty streets, feeling the demon's laughter vibrating through his bones. Marcus pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of the storage facility's bathroom, his hand shaking as he splashed water on his face. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows that made his reflection look like a stranger. 3 days had passed since he'd opened the armor, and sleep had become impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, the memories surged forward like a dam bursting. He saw himself standing in a torch-lit castle courtyard, but it wasn't him. Not exactly. The body was different, younger, broader. Sir Aldric de Montfort. The name came to him unbidden, along with the weight of chainmail beneath a blue and gold surcoat. Around him, other knights prepared for what they called the final hunt. Their quarry wasn't human. Marcus gripped the sink's edge until his knuckles went white. In Afghanistan, he'd attributed the visions to combat stress, PTSD manifesting in elaborate medieval fantasies. The army psychiatrists had agreed, prescribing pills that dulled the edges but never quite silenced the whispers. Now he understood why the medication had never worked. You couldn't medicate away someone else's memories. The storage unit waited for him in the gathering dusk. He'd tried to stay away, but something pulled him back each evening like a moth to flame. The lock felt familiar in his hands now, as if he'd turned this same key 1,000 times before. Inside, the armor gleamed despite the poor lighting, and the sword lay where he'd left it, partially unsheathed. He'd researched medieval heraldry at the public library, searching for the symbols etched into the breastplate. The results had been frustratingly vague, references to a minor noble house that had vanished from records around 1347, the same year the Black Death ravaged Europe. But there were other references, buried in obscure manuscripts that survived in digital archives. Mentions of the Order of the Final Hunt, knights who rode out to face something that wasn't plague at all. Marcus approached the armor slowly. Each step forward brought the memories into sharper focus. Aldric's life unfolded in fragments. A childhood spent in drafty castle halls, training with sword and lance, the day he took his vows as a knight. But underneath it all, growing like a tumor, was the awareness of what stalked the countryside. Villages emptied overnight, not by disease but by something that left no bodies behind. Only shadows burned into stone walls. He knelt beside the sword and wrapped his fingers around the leather-bound hilt. The metal was warm to the touch, impossibly so. The moment he lifted it, the storage unit around him seemed to fade, replaced by the great hall of Montfort Castle. Tapestries depicted hunting scenes, but the prey in these images had too many teeth, too many joints bending in wrong directions. A fire crackled in the massive hearth, and sitting across from him was Brother Marcus, not his namesake, but a monk whose knowledge of forbidden things had made him invaluable to their cause. "The armor will remember," the monk said, his voice echoing across 7 centuries. "Each piece carries the weight of what we faced. Wear it, and you become part of the chain that binds them." Marcus, the modern Marcus, tried to pull away from the vision, but Aldric's memories held him fast. The monk continued speaking, explaining how they discovered the truth about the creatures that emerged during times of great suffering. Parasites from somewhere else, feeding on despair and multiplying in chaos. The order had been formed to hunt them down before they could establish permanent holds in the world. But we failed. Aldric's voice spoke through Marcus's lips. We were too few, and they were too many. The storage unit snapped back into focus, leaving Marcus gasping on the concrete floor. The sword had fallen from his grip, clattering against the metal shelving, his vision blurred, and for a moment he wasn't sure which memories belonged to whom. Had he fought in Afghanistan? Or had Aldric faced the creatures in medieval England? The distinction was becoming harder to maintain. Outside, car doors slammed in the parking lot. Marcus heard voices, 2 men talking in low, urgent tones. He couldn't make out the words, but something about their presence made his skin crawl. Moving carefully, He peered through the gap beneath the rolling door. Two figures in dark suits stood near a black sedan, both looking directly at his unit. They held devices that beeped softly in the night air, some kind of scanning equipment. As Marcus watched, one of them pointed toward his hiding place and said something that made his blood freeze. The resonance is strongest here. After 700 years, someone's finally awakened it. The other figure nodded and reached into his jacket, withdrawing something that gleamed silver in the parking lot's harsh lights. Then we finish what the order started. The armor can't be allowed to choose another bearer. Marcus's hand instinctively moved toward the sword as the men began walking toward his unit. Marcus pressed his back against the cold brick wall of the alley, his breath coming in ragged gasps that formed small clouds in the frigid air. The weight of the armor beneath his jacket felt different now, not just heavy metal but alive somehow, pulsing with each beat of his heart. 3 blocks behind him, sirens wailed through the night, searching for answers to questions the police couldn't even formulate. The convenience store clerk's terrified face haunted him. The kid couldn't have been older than 20, probably working the graveyard shift to pay for college. When Marcus had walked in for cigarettes, everything seemed normal until their eyes met. Then the kid's expression shifted from bored indifference to absolute terror, as if he was staring into the depths of hell itself. "Please," the clerk had whispered, backing toward the register. "Please, don't hurt me." Marcus had tried to speak, to reassure him, but when he opened his mouth, something else emerged, words in a language that predated English by centuries, spoken in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. The fluorescent lights above had flickered and died, plunging the store into darkness save for the eerie blue glow emanating from beneath Marcus's clothes. He'd fled before the kid could call for help, but apparently it was too late. Now, hidden in the shadows between 2 abandoned buildings, Marcus fumbled for his phone with trembling fingers. Sarah picked up on the first ring. "Marcus? Thank God. Where are you?" "I don't know," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Somewhere downtown." "Sarah, something's happening to me. Something's wrong." "I've been researching all night," she said, her words coming fast and urgent. "The symbols you described, the armor, I found references in some very old texts. There's a connection to something called the Order of the Iron Veil. They were medieval knights, but not the kind that served kings." A cat knocked over a trash can nearby, and Marcus spun toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to where a sword would hang at his side. The gesture felt natural, practiced, though he'd never worn a blade in his life. "They served something else," Sarah continued, "something that existed before recorded history. The texts are fragmentary, but they suggest the knights weren't entirely human anymore by the end." "By the end of what?" "That's just it. There's no clear record of what happened to them. They just vanished from history around 1347, right before the Black Death swept through Europe." Marcus closed his eyes and immediately regretted it. Behind his lids, images flashed like broken film strips, villages consumed by unnatural darkness, knights in blackened armor walking among plague victims who rose again with empty eye sockets, a massive stone chamber deep underground where something ancient and hungry waited to be fed. "The plague," he whispered. "They didn't just disappear, they caused it." Silence stretched between them before Sarah spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Marcus, there's something else. I found a record of American military operations during World War II, something called Project Inheritance. They were recovering artifacts from bombed monasteries and churches across Europe. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. The nightmares that had followed him home from Afghanistan weren't from the war at all. They were from something much older, something that had been waiting in that storage unit for decades, brought back by soldiers who had no idea what they were handling. "How many others?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I don't know. But Marcus, you need to get somewhere safe, away from people. The texts describe a transformation process. It happens gradually at first, then accelerates." As if summoned by her words, pain lanced through Marcus's chest. He looked down to see the blue glow intensifying beneath his jacket, the light now visible through the fabric. When he pressed his hand against it, the metal felt warm, almost hot, and he could swear he felt it shifting against his skin. "It's getting worse," he said. "Sarah, I can feel it changing me. When I looked at that kid in the store, I wanted to—" He stopped, unable to voice the violent hunger that had surged through him. "Listen to me," Sarah said firmly. "There's a place we can go. An old church about an hour north of the city. St. Bartholomew's. It's been abandoned for years, but the records show it was built on a site that once housed a monastery, one that specialized in containing dangerous artifacts." Another wave of pain coursed through him, stronger this time. When it passed, Marcus realized he could hear things he shouldn't be able to hear, conversations from blocks away, the heartbeats of sleeping people in nearby buildings, the sound of blood flowing through veins. "I'm running out of time," he said. "Then we move now. Can you make it to the old train yard on 5th Street? I'll pick you up there." Marcus pushed himself away from the wall, steadying himself as the world seemed to tilt around him. In the distance, the sirens were getting closer. "I'll be there," he said, and ended the call before Sarah could hear the inhuman growl that escaped his throat. The forest pressed in around Marcus like a living thing, branches scraping against the rusted metal of his stolen truck as he navigated the narrow logging road. 3 days had passed since he'd fled the city, 3 days of driving deeper into the wilderness of northern Maine, following half-remembered glimpses from dreams that weren't dreams at all. The armor lay wrapped in canvas in the truck bed, but he could feel its presence like a constant weight against his spine. Sometimes, when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he swore he saw movement beneath the tarp, the subtle rise and fall of breathing where there should be none. His phone had died hours ago, though it hardly mattered. No signal reached this deep into the woods anyway. The GPS had lost satellite connection somewhere around the last gas station, leaving him to navigate by instinct and the pull he felt in his chest, drawing him north like a compass needle seeking magnetic true. The headlights swept across weathered tree trunks and exposed granite as the road curved sharply left. Marcus downshifted, the transmission grinding in protest. The truck was running on fumes and borrowed time, but he sensed he was close now. The dreams had grown more vivid with each passing mile, showing him glimpses of stone foundations carpeted in moss, of standing stones arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate. A gap in the trees revealed his destination. The ruins weren't marked on any map he'd ever seen, but they sprawled across a natural clearing like broken teeth. What remained of the settlement looked ancient beyond measure. Not medieval, but something far older. Stone foundations outlined structures that had never known conventional architecture, their angles subtly wrong in ways that made his eyes water. Marcus killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, memories not his own flooding through his consciousness. He remembered this place, not from his deployment in Afghanistan, not from any human campaign, but from something that stretched back through bloodlines and borrowed flesh across centuries. The wind picked up, setting the canvas tarp to flapping like wings. He climbed out of the truck on unsteady legs. The air tasted of copper and ozone, charged with the kind of tension that preceded violent storms. Above, stars wheeled in patterns that seemed almost familiar, as if he'd navigated by them in some previous existence. The armor was heavier than it should have been, as he dragged it from the truck bed, the metal plates shifting with sounds like whispered conversations. He hauled it to the center of the ruins, where a circular depression in the stone suggested an altar or focal point. As soon as the armor touched the ancient rock, the whispers stopped. The silence was absolute. No insects, no wind, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Even his own heartbeat seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. Marcus stepped back, but found he couldn't move more than a few paces from the armor. An invisible tether held him close, growing stronger with each second. The canvas wrapping began to smolder. Threads of smoke rose from the fabric, though Marcus detected no heat. The material simply dissolved, eaten away by something that left the metal beneath untouched and gleaming. As the last of the canvas crumbled to ash, the armor began to move. Not the clumsy animation of Hollywood monsters, but the fluid motion of something that had never truly been dead. The breastplate expanded as if drawing breath. Gauntleted fingers flexed, testing joints that should have been frozen with age and neglect. The helmet turned toward Marcus with deliberate intent. Behind the visor, twin points of red light kindled. At last, the armor spoke, its voice the grinding of stone on stone. The circle closes, the debt comes due. Marcus tried to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. He watched in horror as his body moved without his consent, walking toward the armored figure that rose to meet him. His hands reached for the clasps and buckles that would secure the ancient metal to his flesh. "No," he whispered, even as his fingers worked to unfasten his jacket. "I won't let you." "You have no choice," the entity replied through the armor that would soon be his cage. "You bore my essence across the ocean, carried it through wars that fed me well. Every life you took in service of your country was an offering, every nightmare a prayer. Did you think such devotion would go unrewarded?" The first piece of armor, a vambrace, slipped over his forearm like a second skin. Where the metal touched flesh, his scars began to glow with the same red light that burned behind the helmet's visor. Pain lanced through him, but deeper than pain was the terrible recognition of coming home. This was what he'd always been meant for. Every battlefield, every brother lost, every sleepless night, all of it had been preparation for this moment. The armor embraced him like a lover, and Marcus felt his humanity begin to slip away. The screaming started at 3 in the morning. Marcus jolted awake on the storage facility's concrete floor, his body slick with sweat despite the October chill. But the screaming wasn't coming from his dreams this time. It was echoing through the corridors outside, bouncing off metal doors and cinder-block walls like a pinball of terror. He scrambled to his feet, the armor's weight seeming to press down on him even though he wasn't wearing it. The medieval plates hung motionless on their makeshift stand, but something felt different. Wrong. The air around them shimmered with an almost imperceptible heat haze, and the metal itself seemed to pulse with a dark heartbeat. Another scream pierced the night, closer now, human, but distorted, as if the sound was being filtered through something that didn't quite understand how human vocal cords worked. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and crept to the roll-up door. Through the gap at the bottom, he could see emergency lights strobing in the distance, painting the facility's pathways in hellish red. The night manager's office was lit up, its windows casting yellow rectangles across the asphalt. A shadow moved past one of those windows, too tall, too angular, moving in a way that suggested joints bent in impossible directions. The memories crashed over him like a tide of acid. Not his memories, older ones, threaded through consciousness like barbed wire. He was Sir Edmund de Grey, standing in the ruins of a village outside Damascus, watching his men tear apart fleeing civilians with their bare hands. Their eyes had gone black, their movements predatory and wrong, as if something else was wearing their bodies like ill-fitting clothes. He was also Marcus Webb, crouched in a storage unit in suburban Texas, listening to history repeat itself. The thing wearing the night manager's face appeared at the end of his corridor, moving with that same unnatural gait he remembered from the Crusades. Its head turned toward his unit with mechanical precision, and even from 50 yards away, Marcus could see its eyes had gone completely black. "I know you're in there," it called, but the voice was layered, the manager's nervous tenor wrapped around something much older and infinitely patient. "I can smell the iron, taste the centuries of blood on it." Marcus pressed himself against the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. The armor behind him seemed to grow heavier, its presence filling the small space like smoke. He could feel it calling to him, promising strength, promising the power to fight back. But he remembered what that power cost. The villages burned, the innocents slaughtered, the gradual erosion of everything that made him human, one unholy victory at a time. "You can't run from what you are," the thing continued, its footsteps echoing closer. "We've been together too long, you and I, through too many lives, too many wars. The armor always finds its way back to us." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, trying to separate his thoughts from the ancient memories bleeding through. Sir Edmund had thought he was blessed by God, chosen to wield divine power against the infidel. He'd been too proud, too desperate for glory to recognize the corruption spreading through his soul like gangrene. But Marcus had seen what war could do to a man without supernatural influence. He'd watched good soldiers become monsters in Afghanistan, seen how easy it was to lose yourself in violence when the alternative was death. The armor hadn't created that darkness. It had simply fed on what was already there. A metallic screech filled the air as something began to pry at his door from the outside. The reinforced steel groaned and buckled, creating a gap wide enough for black fingers to snake through. Marcus looked back at the armor one last time. Even now he could feel its seductive pull, the promise of power and purpose. No more sleeping in doorways, no more scraping for change, no more feeling helpless and forgotten. But he'd been a soldier long enough to recognize a bad deal when he saw one. Instead of reaching for the breastplate, Marcus grabbed the emergency axe mounted on the wall, left over from the unit's previous incarnation as a maintenance closet. The thing outside hissed as the door bent further, revealing glimpses of what the night manager had become. Its face was a ruin of stretched skin and exposed bone, held together by something that had no understanding of human anatomy. "Wrong choice," it snarled, forcing its head through the gap. Marcus raised the axe, feeling the weight of every life he'd taken, every friend he'd lost, every night he'd spent wondering if there was any point to his continued existence. But for the first time in years, his hands weren't shaking. "Maybe," he said, bringing the blade down. "But it's my choice to make." The axe bit deep, and something that wasn't quite blood sprayed across the concrete walls. Behind him, the armor began to scream. The weight of the armor pressed against Marcus's shoulders as he descended the narrow stone steps carved into the hillside behind Riverside Cemetery. Each footfall echoed in the darkness below, a rhythm that matched the ancient heartbeat thrumming in his chest. The helmet's visor cast everything in a crimson hue, but somehow he could see perfectly, every crack in the weathered stone, every tendril of mist that coiled upward from the depths. Behind him, Sarah's breathing came in short, frightened gasps. "Marcus, please, this isn't you." But it was him. That was the terrible truth clawing at his consciousness. The memories flooding back weren't invasions from some malevolent spirit. They were his own, stretching back through centuries of warfare and slaughter. The trenches of Afghanistan, the muddy fields of Verdun, the blood-soaked grass at Gettysburg, the frozen hell of Valley Forge. War after war, death after death, rebirth after rebirth. "The armor chooses," he heard himself say, though his voice carried harmonics that belonged to ages past. "It has always chosen those marked by battle, scarred by loss. We are its vessels, its eternal soldiers." The steps ended at a circular chamber carved from living rock. Ancient symbols covered the walls, not quite Celtic, not quite runic, but something far older that made the eye water to look upon directly. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with centuries of offerings. Around it, the remnants of previous bearers lay scattered, corroded mail links, rusted sword hilts, fragments of bone that crumbled at the slightest disturbance. Sarah stumbled down the final steps, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the grotesque tableau. "Jesus Christ, Marcus! What is this place?" The knowledge flowed into him unbidden, each detail crystallizing with perfect clarity. The Crimson Brotherhood maintained 13 sanctuaries across the old world. This is the last. He moved toward the altar with fluid grace, despite the armor's bulk. When the Brotherhood fell, when the Church's hunters finally cornered us in the Black Forest, the survivors scattered. They carried pieces of the truth to distant shores, waiting for the armor to awaken again. "You're talking about yourself like you were there, but that's impossible." "I was there." The words came out flat, certain. "I watched Brother Heinrich fall with a crossbow bolt through his throat. I held Sister Morgana as she burned. I sailed from Bremen in 1847 with the last of the armor, seeking a land where we could practice the old ways without persecution." Marcus's hands, His hands, but moving with practiced precision that belonged to another time, began arranging items from his pack on the altar. The photographs Sarah had found, each one showing him in different eras, different wars, the brass compass that had guided him to this place, the leather journal filled with Dr. Voss's observations about soldiers who carried something ancient in their eyes. Every generation the armor calls to those who've seen too much death, he continued. Veterans broken by war, their minds already fractured enough to accept what others would reject. It offers purpose, continuity, a way to transform senseless slaughter into something sacred. Sarah backed against the curved wall, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. Sacred? You're talking about murder, Marcus, about becoming some kind of executioner. The word hung in the air like incense. That's what we are, what we've always been. The Brotherhood understood that some evils can only be cleansed through blood. Corrupt nobles, false priests, those who prey upon the innocent. We were the sword of justice when justice failed. He lifted the helmet from his head, feeling cool air against his sweat-dampened face for the first time in hours. Without the armor's crimson filter, the chamber looked different, older, more worn, but somehow less alien. The symbols on the walls were just carvings now, not burning brands that seared themselves into his consciousness. But that's not why the armor woke up this time, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him like ice water. The network. Dr. Voss wasn't just studying us, he was collecting us, building a database of veterans marked by the armor's touch, tracking our movements, our patterns. He set the helmet on the altar's edge, where it gleamed like a freshly spilled wound. Someone's been hunting the Brotherhood's descendants, picking us off one by one. Who? The sound reached them before Marcus could answer. Footsteps on the stone stairs above, moving with military precision. Multiple sets, descending in formation. Sarah spun toward the entrance, her flashlight beam stabbing upward into the darkness. Too late, Marcus whispered, his hand closing around the helmet's rim. They found us. The first figure appeared at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the night sky. Even from this distance, Marcus could see the familiar bulk of tactical gear, the glint of modern weapons. But there was something else, something that made his blood run cold. The figure wore armor, too, not medieval plate, but something newer, something that gleamed with the same malevolent crimson light. The abandoned warehouse echoed with Marcus's labored breathing as he pressed his back against the cold concrete wall. Through the shattered windows, he could see the cultists moving in coordinated patterns around the building's perimeter. They'd found him again, drawn by the armor's ancient call like moths to a flame that would consume them all. His fingers traced the leather-wrapped hilt of the sword at his side. The weapon felt natural in his grip now, as if he'd wielded it for centuries. Perhaps he had. The memories were becoming clearer with each passing hour. Flashes of battlefields that predated gunpowder, of enemies that wore human faces but harbored something far more sinister beneath. You cannot run forever, Marcus. The voice drifted through the broken glass, honey sweet and poisonous. Dr. Whitmore stood in the parking lot, her pristine white coat a stark contrast to the decay surrounding her. The armor has chosen you, yes, but you're fighting your true nature. Embrace what you are. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the chainmail beneath his jacket. The metal had fused with his skin in places now, becoming part of him in ways that should have been horrifying but felt oddly comforting, like coming home after a long, exhausting journey. I've seen your files, Whitmore continued, stepping closer to the building. Afghanistan, Iraq. The things you witnessed, the friends you lost. You think those were your first wars? Your soul has been fighting this battle since before Christ walked the earth. A memory surfaced unbidden, standing atop a hill overlooking a valley filled with screaming men and horses. But the screams weren't entirely human, and the blood that soaked into the earth was black as oil. He'd worn this same armor then, carried this same sword, felt this same crushing weight of responsibility. The cultists began their chant, voices rising in harmonious discord that made the warehouse windows vibrate. Marcus recognized the language now, though he'd never learned it in any classroom. It was older than Latin, older than civilization itself. They were calling something, opening a door that should remain forever sealed. He thought of Jenny, probably sitting in her apartment, wondering why he hadn't returned her calls. She deserved better than this, better than watching the man she loved disappear into something that belonged in nightmares and fevered dreams. But the armor wouldn't let him go. It had waited too long to find a suitable host. Through the gaps in the cultists' formation, Marcus spotted movement in the shadows. More of them, emerging from storm drains and abandoned cars. Their eyes reflected the streetlight like animals, and their mouths stretched into grins that revealed too many teeth. Some still wore the faces he recognized from the storage facility auction, but they'd been altered. The transformation was spreading faster now. Marcus gripped the sword tighter and felt its whispered promise of power. He could end this. The armor knew how. It carried the knowledge of 1,000 battles against these creatures and their human servants. But victory would come at a price. Each time he used the armor's gifts, he felt more of himself slip away, replaced by the ancient warrior who'd first worn this steel. "The door is almost open," Whitmore called out. "Can you feel it, Marcus? The thin places are weakening. Soon our masters will walk this world again, as they did before the ice came and drove them into the spaces between. You can help us usher in a new age, or you can watch humanity burn as we drag it kicking and screaming into evolution." The chanting reached a crescendo, and the air itself began to shimmer. Reality bent inward like heated plastic, and through the distortion, Marcus glimpsed something that made his trained soldier's mind recoil in terror. Tentacles thick as tree trunks writhed in darkness that had texture and weight. Eyes like dying stars regarded him with ancient hunger. Something wet and rope-like slapped against the warehouse wall, leaving a trail of luminescent slime. The door was opening. Marcus stood, the armor's weight no longer a burden but a comfort. The sword sang as he drew it, the metal gleaming within a light that pushed back against the growing shadows. Whatever happened next, whatever he became in the process, he wouldn't let these things loose upon an unsuspecting world. He'd made that same choice before in a dozen different lifetimes. The armor remembered, even when the flesh forgot. This was his purpose, his curse, his eternal duty. The cultists pressed closer to the building, their eyes now completely black, their movements becoming less human with each passing second. Behind them, something massive pressed against the weakening barrier between worlds, eager to reclaim a planet it had ruled before mankind learned to make fire. Marcus smiled grimly and stepped toward the door. Time to remind them why they'd been cast out in the first place. The thing that had been sleeping inside Marcus Reeves for 800 years stretched its limbs and felt the familiar weight of steel and leather. The armor fit like a second skin, every plate and joint remembering the shape of its true wearer. Through Marcus's eyes, it surveyed the warehouse that had become a battlefield. Sarah pressed herself against the loading dock, clutching the blessed silver cross Detective Rodriguez had given her. The metal burned cold against her palm as she watched Marcus, or what Marcus had become, stride through the shadows with predatory grace. His movements were wrong, too fluid, like a wolf wearing human skin. "You cannot run from what you are," the thing spoke through Marcus's mouth, but the voice carried harmonics that made the warehouse windows vibrate. 8 centuries I have waited. 8 centuries of whispers and half-memories, bleeding through the veil between lives. Detective Rodriguez circled wide, his service weapon trained on the armored figure. The bullets had done nothing before, but he kept the gun steady anyway. It was better than admitting he was completely helpless against something that shouldn't exist. "Marcus is still in there," Sarah called out, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I saw him fight you. He's stronger than you think." The helmet turned toward her with mechanical precision. "Marcus Reeves was a broken vessel when I found him. Shell shock, they called it in his modern war. Battle fatigue. Post-traumatic stress, such clinical terms for a soul cracked open and ready to receive its true nature." The thing that wore Marcus's face began to pace, the armor clanking with each step. Do you know what it's like to remember killing with sword and mace, to feel the hot blood of your enemies splash across your face, only to be told by doctors and psychiatrists that these are mere hallucinations, symptoms of trauma that never happened? Rodriguez caught Sarah's eye and gestured toward the far exit. If they could reach the squad cars, call for backup with heavy weapons, maybe they stood a chance. But the armored figure was between them and escape, and those glowing eyes seemed to track every micro-movement they made. But the memories were real, the voice continued, growing stronger. Sir Godwin de Montfort, Knight Templar, slayer of the Saracen hordes, I lived, I killed, I died with honor on the field of battle, only to be bound to this cursed armor by arts darker than any holy war. Sarah's mind raced. If you're bound to the armor, then taking it off would accomplish nothing. The thing laughed, a sound like grinding metal. The binding goes deeper now. Flesh and steel, soul and spirit, all one. Your Marcus welcomed me in his dreams, night after night, until the barriers dissolved completely. But even as it spoke, Sarah caught something in its posture, a slight tremor in the left gauntlet, a hesitation before each step. Marcus was still fighting, still trying to regain control from somewhere deep inside. Rodriguez saw it too. You're not as merged as you pretend, he said, adjusting his grip on the weapon. If you were complete, you wouldn't need to keep talking. You'd have killed us already. The helmet snapped toward him. Careful, mortal. I have ended bloodlines older than your pathetic civilization. Then why haven't you ended us? Sarah stepped forward, the cross burning brighter in her hand. Because Marcus won't let you. Because somewhere in there, a good man is fighting a monster that feeds on other people's trauma. The armored figure staggered, and for a moment the glow in the eye slits flickered. When it spoke again, the voice was partially Marcus's own, strained and desperate. Sarah, run. Can't hold it much longer. The armor, it's not just metal, it's a prison that became a doorway. Every knight who wore it, everyone who died in it, they're all here, all angry, all hungry. The thing reasserted control, backhanding Marcus's consciousness into submission. Enough! I will not be denied my resurrection by the mewling of a broken soldier. It raised one gauntleted hand, and the shadows in the warehouse began to move independently, reaching towards Sarah and Rodriguez like grasping fingers. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and their breath came out in visible puffs. The armor was blessed once, Sarah said suddenly, pieces clicking together in her mind. That's why it could hold you, but blessings can be renewed. Purifications can be repeated. She held up the silver cross, and its light pushed back the reaching shadows. What happens to an ancient evil when it meets a faith that refuses to break? The thing wearing Marcus's face snarled and charged forward, gauntlets extended like claws. But Sarah stood her ground, cross blazing in her hand, betting everything on the hope that somewhere inside that cursed steel, Marcus Reeves was still fighting for his soul. The warehouse trembled as Marcus stepped forward, the ancient armor moving with fluid grace despite its weight. Each footstep rang against the concrete floor like a death knell, and the shadows seemed to recoil from his presence. The entity that had been Jenkins writhed in the corner, its form flickering between human flesh and something far more primitive and hungry. You cannot stop what has already begun, it hissed, voice layered with harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. The sleepers are waking. The old contracts are being honored. Marcus felt the armor's consciousness pressing against his own, sharing knowledge that spanned millennia. He saw flashes of ancient battlefields where creatures like Jenkins had torn through armies, witnessed the desperate alliance between human knights and something older than civilization itself. The armor was not just protection, it was a prison and a weapon, forged in the space between worlds. The contracts were broken long ago, Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure the words were his own. The gauntlets flexed, and ethereal fire danced between the metal fingers. Your kind lost the right to walk among mortals. Jenkins' form solidified slightly, revealing features that were almost human but wrong in fundamental ways. The eyes held too much depth, as if looking into them might reveal the curvature of space itself. When it smiled, the teeth were translucent and sharp as broken glass. Lost? We never lost anything, Knight. We simply learned patience. The creature gestured to the storage unit surrounding them. Do you know what lies sleeping in these boxes? What desperate souls have unknowingly collected? This place is a museum of forgotten things, and every forgotten thing remembers what it once was. The armor's helm turned slightly, and Marcus's enhanced vision revealed the truth. In unit after unit, he could sense items pulsing with malevolent energy, artifacts that had been sold, abandoned, or hidden away by people who knew just enough to fear them, but not enough to destroy them properly. The storage facility wasn't just a business, it was a carefully curated collection of doorways. The auction house, the estate sales, the desperate people selling grandparents' belongings they don't understand, Jenkins continued, beginning to circle Marcus like a predator testing its prey. We've been seeding these places for decades. Every cursed mirror, every ritual blade, every binding circle carved into wood and sold as antique furniture, they all find their way here eventually. Marcus's hand moved to the sword at his side, the blade humming with anticipation. The armor showed him how to draw it, how to channel the ethereal fire through its edge. But it also showed him the cost. Each time the sword was used, it required payment in memories, in pieces of soul, in fragments of the wielder's humanity. And when enough gather in one place, Jenkins said, its form growing larger and more substantial, when the resonance reaches the proper frequency, the barriers grow thin. Tonight, veteran, tonight we tear open a hole that will never close. The warehouse lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the armor's inner radiance. In that supernatural glow, Marcus could see other shapes moving between the storage units, things that had been waiting in the spaces between the locked doors, feeding on the accumulated psychic residue of forgotten lives. Sarah, Marcus whispered, thinking of the storage facility employee who had tried to warn him away. Where is she? Jenkins laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. The girl, she serves her purpose. Every business needs human employees after all. Someone has to sign the contracts, accept the payments, and ensure the proper items find their way to the proper units. She's been very helpful, though I suspect she's beginning to remember things she wasn't supposed to forget. The armor's consciousness surged, filling Marcus with knowledge of the creature's weaknesses. But the information came with a cost. He could feel his own memories beginning to fade, replaced by the experiences of previous knights who had worn this cursed protection. He saw their faces, their final battles, their inevitable defeats or Pyrrhic victories. The armor had been passed down through generations, never destroyed, always waiting for the next desperate soul who would trade everything for the power to fight monsters. Choose quickly, veteran, Jenkins said, its form now towering over Marcus. Join us willingly and retain some fragment of what you were. Oppose us and watch as we transform your entire species into cattle. The old world is returning whether you fight or not. Marcus drew the sword, and ethereal fire blazed along its edge. The creatures lurking in the shadows hissed and withdrew, but Jenkins only smiled wider. Very well, it said. Let us see if this generation's knight proves more capable than the last. The warehouse erupted into chaos as Jenkins lunged forward, no longer maintaining any pretense of humanity. Around them, storage unit doors began to swing open of their own accord, releasing decades of accumulated darkness into the world. The thing that had once been Marcus stood in the center of the storage facility's main corridor, its ancient consciousness finally whole after centuries of fragmented existence across countless hosts. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows across the medieval armor that gleamed with an otherworldly sheen. Detective Sarah Chen crouched behind an overturned cart, her service weapon trained on the armored figure. She'd seen impossible things tonight, but her mind still struggled to process what Marcus had become. The homeless veteran she'd tried to help was gone, consumed by something that predated civilization itself. "Marcus," she called out, her voice echoing in the narrow space, I know you're still in there somewhere. Fight it." The helmet turned toward her with mechanical precision. When it spoke, Marcus's voice was layered with something far older and infinitely more malevolent. The vessel called Marcus served his purpose. His memories of war, of death, of horror, they fed me well. But now I am complete. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, but she hesitated. Somewhere beneath that armor, Marcus might still exist. The man who'd spent his last $50 hoping for a better tomorrow, who'd carried the weight of his service and his homelessness with quiet dignity, deserved better than this. The armored figure began to advance, each footstep ringing against the concrete floor like a funeral bell. "You cannot comprehend what you face, mortal. I have walked through the dreams of warriors across millennia. Every battle, every death, every moment of terror has strengthened me. Your modern conflicts are merely the latest feast." Behind Sarah, she heard the soft shuffle of footsteps. Jake, the storage facility's night manager, had been following the sound of voices. His face went pale as he took in the scene before him. "What the hell is that thing?" he whispered. "Something that should have stayed buried," Sarah replied, never taking her eyes off the approaching figure. "Get out of here, Jake. Call for backup. Military, National Guard, whatever you can get." But Jake was frozen, staring at the armor with a mixture of terror and recognition. "I've seen that before," he muttered. "In my grandfather's journals. He was a collector, dealt in medieval artifacts. He wrote about armor that was cursed, that had to be sealed away." The entity paused, its attention shifting to Jake. "Ah, the descendants of those who imprisoned me. How fitting that you should witness my return." Sarah seized the moment of distraction and fired 3 rounds center mass. The bullets struck the armor with bright sparks but failed to penetrate. The impact staggered the creature, but didn't slow its advance. "Physical weapons are useless," it said with what sounded like amusement. "I am sustained by something far more powerful than flesh and bone." Jake suddenly broke from his paralysis, running toward a storage unit at the far end of the corridor. "The seal!" he shouted back to Sarah. "My grandfather left instructions. If the armor was ever found, if it ever awakened, there's a way to stop it." The entity let out a roar that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself and gave chase. Sarah followed, reloading as she ran. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, lined with metal doors that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Jake reached Unit 247 and began frantically working the combination lock. Come on," he muttered as the armored figure closed the distance between them. The lock clicked open just as the entity reached them. Jake threw open the door, revealing a small space filled with ancient texts, religious artifacts, and what appeared to be fragments of similar armor. At the center sat an ornate wooden box covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. "The binding ritual," Jake said, grabbing the box. "It requires a willing sacrifice, someone who understands the true cost of war." The entity lunged forward, but Sarah threw herself between them, emptying her clip into the helmet's visor. This time, something cracked. For a brief moment, she saw Marcus's eyes looking out at her, filled with pain and desperation. "Do it!" Marcus's voice broke through, weak but determined. "End this. I won't let it use my memories to hurt anyone else." Jake opened the box with trembling hands, revealing an ancient dagger and a scroll covered in Latin text. He began to read, his voice growing stronger with each word. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and the entity stumbled backward, clutching at its helmet. The armor began to crack and tarnish, centuries of age catching up to it in moments. The malevolent presence fought against the binding, but Marcus's willpower, strengthened by his military training and his desire to protect others, held it in check. With a final echoing scream that seemed to come from the depths of time itself, the entity collapsed. The armor crumbled to rust and dust, leaving only the faint outline of a man who had found peace at last. In the sudden silence, Sarah and Jake stared at the remains, knowing that some nightmares end only when someone is brave enough to sacrifice everything to stop them.